Thank you very much. Good morning to all the distinguished guests and to familiar faces in the audience. The agenda for the T20 is the last one, so I have to pick and choose. So I'm going to focus today more on economic issues and leave aside the humanitarian, political, and other issues. Let me get to the nub of my talk. I'm going to argue that world growth hasn't picked up ever since the crisis. And in the G20 meetings recently, as well as the IMF meetings in Lima, there's now talk of, there's first the subprime crisis, then there's the European crisis, and now there's talk of an emerging market crisis, or potential emerging market crisis. And I'm going to argue these aren't three different crises. They're the same crisis happening in different ways. But the reason that this crisis is moving on from country to country or region to region is something that we have to be very worried about. And there is scope for global action. It's difficult, but it may be necessary if we have to get out of this regime of rolling crises, which I would argue didn't start with the global financial crisis. It actually started before, in the 1990s, with the emerging market crisis then. Broadly speaking, in the economic sphere, we need broad new rules of the game, as well as the reform of the multilateral institutions to enforce them. Is this going to happen in a hurry? No. That reflects some of the deficiencies in the multilateral discussion. But it's time to start talking. And I would argue that some of the problems in global economic management are problems that you can see in management of some of the other issues that were put on the table, and there are some similarities. So with that as a description of what I'm going to talk about, let me jump into it. We've had fairly slow industrial country growth for the last 7 years, since 2008. And there are various arguments for why this is the case. Of course, the first argument is we had a very deep crisis. But typically, you emerge from crises quite fast. Recoveries from recessions are typically V-shaped. But we haven't had much of a recovery, let alone a V-shaped recovery. So one argument is this is because of the nature of the crisis. A lot of debt taken on, debt overhangs on corporations, on households, make it very hard for them to borrow. And of course, most recently, governments have taken on debt, partly shifting debt from the corporations and households to their own balance sheets, and governments are also reaching the limits of their debt. So one argument is it's debt, and we need the deleveraging, and deleveraging is taking more time, and therefore one shouldn't be too impatient. Of course, we did try to stimulate economies. The 2008 summit and subsequent summits were well known for the G20 urging countries to spend if they could. And a number of countries took up the challenge of spending, and there were massive fiscal stimulus packages, including in our own country, where we had 3 sequential stimulus packages. These haven't done the trick. They haven't quite restored growth, including in our own country. There are arguments resurfacing today that the specifics of stimulus matter. We should build infrastructure, and infrastructure is long-lasting, high returns, especially in times when construction material and construction costs are low because the industry is underemployed. So let's build infrastructure. This was the mantra in industrial countries. However, infrastructure investment took off only in a few countries, and where it has taken off, it hasn't had much positive effect. Japan, for example, massive infrastructure investments over the last couple of decades, but it still is not out of the woods. And part of the problem is, in many industrial countries, finding worthwhile infrastructure to build is hard. I mean, there's a lot of infrastructure already out there. Yes, everybody can see the potholes outside the window which needs fixing. Everybody can see a bridge or two that needs fixing. But beyond that, the large infrastructure projects that will really move the needle on growth are both harder to find, harder to coordinate on, and harder to execute. And I think that the difficulties in implementation of infrastructure in industrial countries aren't realized enough. In our own country, of course, we have massive infrastructure needs, and we're trying to go about them. But infrastructure in industrial countries is more difficult. So as people have found that stimulus, whether monetary or fiscal, doesn't seem to be restoring growth, and even deleveraging. There's been a fair amount of deleveraging in the United States, some in Europe. Even deleveraging doesn't seem to have restored growth. They turn to the next possible reason why it hasn't happened, and that's because structurally there were problems in the industrial countries which limited growth, and we need to fix those structural problems, right? Now, what could be the structural problems? Most recently, a number of arguments that the nature of populations in industrial countries, aging populations, have a different set of demands, a different set of supply possibilities, and unless we cater to them specifically, we're going to see growth slow down, as we've seen in Japan. That's one set of arguments. Another set of arguments pertaining to what we heard just before I came on was on income inequality. Perhaps the movement of incomes towards higher income people has in fact reduced overall demand. After all, poor people consume every rupee that they receive, but rich people, once you've bought your yacht and your private jet, there's not that much more you can spend on. And so the marginal propensity to consume out of incremental income is lower. That's the technical way of saying you don't have much to spend on when you're really rich. And so as a result, what you see perhaps is demand falling off. So one argument is that we've had demand falling off for quite some time in industrial countries. It was boosted temporarily by the heavy debt that they took on pre-crisis, but post-crisis with the high debt, it slowed down considerably. And so we need to find ways of boosting demand, but it may be that it takes structural change, including, some people argue, shifting incomes from the richer to the poorer people, and there have been arguments made along these lines. Another set of arguments are about supply. The real problem is not demand, it's that we haven't had productivity growth in industrial countries of the kind that would warrant sustained growth. And the fairly low productivity growth means that there can't be enough supply even if you generate the demand. And of course, these two feed on each other. If you don't have productivity growth and you're unlikely to grow at a strong pace and create jobs, then people are more circumspect about spending and demand falls off. And similarly, corporations, if they don't see productivity growth, they don't see high profitability, are not going to invest so much, demand falls off. So supply constraints or supply worries create a demand constraint, and similarly, when firms don't see enough demand, they don't actually invest. So these things are highly interrelated. You can't sort of separate one from the other. But the bottom line is that we need structural reforms. For example, if part of the problem is the elderly are going to move out of the workforce and therefore there are going to be supply constraints in the future, we need to find a way to get people who are not ordinarily participating in the labor force to come in, which means that in countries like Japan, there's an argument that we should make it easier for women to come into the labor force, which means structural reforms on making it easier for women to work. And you could argue that in Europe, the biggest constraint to growth is the low productivity in the service industry because of limited competition. The classic example is of the cartelized taxi industry. And why don't we open it up? Organizations like Uber and so on are fighting to do that. But whether in fact there should be reforms which allow that to happen in a more serious way. The problem with structural reforms as a pathway to growth is classically summarized by Jean-Claude Juncker, who said, he was former Prime Minister of Luxembourg, we all know what to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it. So the problem with structural reforms is they have the wrong timing of gain and pain, right? Politically, what you want to do is something that has a lot of gain up front and the pain is down the line because somebody else takes the blame for that. But what happens is, with structural reforms, the pain is up front because you're actually hitting the interests who benefit from the cozy system, the taxi drivers who have a cartelized system, by letting entrants in. The gain comes to the new entrants down the line, but they realize it only down the line after the reforms are done. And so the voters are going to compensate you, 5 years from now, but then your history by that time because the current taxi drivers have voted you out. So the problem with structural reforms is it's always fun to tell somebody else to do it, especially other countries, but doing it in your own country is difficult. So what we have is a real difficulty in generating growth, as a difficulty which is not just post-financial crisis, but I think pre-financial crisis, which in fact explains why we took on so much debt across the world pre-financial crisis in an attempt to pump up growth, which just wasn't happening. So one possible answer is, grow slower, don't grow so fast, and accept that sustainable growth, if you're not willing to do the structural reforms, is actually going to be at a lower rate. Problem is, it's very hard for governments to accept lower growth in the industrial world because the promises they made in times of high growth are coming back to roost. Entitlements in the 1960s on the healthcare, on social security, certainly in the United States, as the current trajectory, are unpayable. You cannot deliver on those promises, they're too big. But even since then, what has happened is you made more and more promises, often to public sector workers. In the state that I know well, because I spent a long time teaching in Chicago, Illinois has made enormous promises to its public sector workers because it's always convenient. Harder to increase current wages because it's your budget, but convenient to increase pensions because somebody else pays for it down the line while you get the credit. And so enormous pension promises which simply cannot be delivered. So you have all these entitlements coming, and then you have debt. Debt taken on during the financial crisis, taken on before the financial crisis. So when you have all this, the only way to pay it is to grow. Growth is an imperative in many industrial countries. But it's not just growth for the sake of growth, it's the distribution of growth. That when you have a slowdown, the worst hit are the newcomers, the young. Because especially in societies which are more insider societies, the insiders are reasonably well protected, but it's the outsiders, the young, the immigrants who get hit, and they can start raising their voice. The high levels of youth unemployment in Europe are a serious source of concern, but now immigrant unemployment is contributing to that. And of course, we talked about inequality. That's also an issue which has come to the forefront. And it's not something to be dismissed lightly. It's one of the biggest sort of forces governing political debate in industrial countries today. The fact that middle-class jobs are being lost to technology, lost to global competition, means that a very strong constituency for stability is getting weaker and weaker. And again, for the middle class, given that good middle class jobs are fairly small in number, you need growth to even create those additional jobs. So growth is absolutely an imperative. And perhaps last, but more to the mind of central bankers, deflation. There's a very strong fear, especially in the United States, given its historical experience in the 30s, that if deflation takes hold, you will have a Japan-like experience and have to write off 15 to 20 years of growth. Now, I think that's a misreading of what happened in Japan, but nevertheless, there is a very strong fear amongst the central banking community across the world that deflation has to be averted at any cost. And therefore, that's another reason to try and promote growth, because growth, if you have reasonable growth, you can avoid the deflation problem. So, bottom line, that I perhaps summarize quickly is growth has been low. Perhaps for decades we have masked it with a fair amount of debt. And the current emerging market slowdown is just a reflection of the slowdown in industrial countries. If you think about the growth model that took off in the 1990s in the emerging markets, it was exporting to the industrial countries. And as the industrial countries slowed down for a while, the emerging markets concealed that slowdown with packages of their own, the massive debt-financed growth, for example, in China. But once they realized that industrial country growth was going to be slow for a much longer time, the emerging markets also stepped down. So what we need in the world is obviously all these structural reforms that we're all reluctant to do. And so we're all looking out for someone in the world to step up and grow faster and pull the world along, right? It used to be the United States, there used to be this engine of growth. Then perhaps some people look to China. But in this environment where nobody is willing to step up, there's a real question of how to give them a push. How do you push somebody to step up and pull us along? And this is where I think we'll enter dangerous territory, where the kind of method we give other people a push is through unconventional monetary policy, including exchange rate intervention, which tends to push capital into other countries. As it pushes capital into other countries, it moves them a little faster for a while. But eventually, this capital, when it moves the other country faster, creates difficulties for that country. We've seen this 3 times, and I'll come to that in a second. And that's what I meant by the crisis shifting from place to place, that we have, in a sense, a global game of musical crisis. And we have to worry about where this ends. Now, you say, how do you say this? I mean, where do you say this from? And I would say go back to the 1990s. In the early 1990s, interest rates were kept very low in industrial countries as countries, including the United States, were trying to revive their banks post the emerging market crisis of the 1980s. So interest rates were low, capital flowed to the emerging markets. As the industrial countries revived and started raising interest rates, capital started flowing out. You had the Mexican crisis, you had the Asian financial crisis, you had the Argentinian crisis, and nearly a Brazilian crisis. All in the span of 3 or 4 years as capital flowed out because monetary policy tightened in industrial countries. So what the emerging market said is, never again, we're not going to be subject to this kind of thing. We're going to resist capital inflows. So every time capital comes in, we're going to build up reserves. You had an enormous build-up of reserves in the emerging markets in the early 2000s. And because capital now was being pushed back, the capital flowing to emerging markets was being pushed back to the industrial countries, the industrial countries some of them started running large current account deficits. The US, 6% at its peak, Spain, Greece, Portugal, all these countries. But think about which countries then got affected by crisis. now the turn of the industrial countries, the US, then Spain, Greece, Portugal. And remember, at this, in 2005, Chairman Bernanke made his, he was still not chairman at that point, but he made his famous savings club speech, where he said the problem for the industrial countries, especially the US, was this flood of capital, of savings coming from the emerging markets and distorting prices in industrial countries and creating real estate booms, etc., etc. So he complained about the capital flowing in and said we can't manage it. That was a prescient speech, and it preceded the US financial crisis, right? Now think about what happened post-financial crisis. Post-financial crisis, the industrial countries slowed down tremendously. No more borrowing from the rest of the world to finance expansion. Fiscal deficits came down. And who now started becoming the next leg of the musical crisis? It was the emerging markets. Massive spending increases, including in India, which attracted a lot of capital, including in China, including in Turkey, including in Brazil. And that hasn't ended well either. That all of us have slowed down considerably because we've had to manage the macroeconomic consequences of absorbing serious amounts of capital. And now, again, as the prospect of interest rates start rising, starts taking hold, the capital is flowing out, leaving debris in its wake. Can we do better than this, where we continuously push capital from one shore to another? Because the next leg of this is again a massive reserve build-up in the emerging markets as they try and deal with the consequences of capital flowing in. So I would argue that what we have to worry about are policies that do this, that extreme monetary policies, including both the exchange rate intervention that some of the emerging markets indulged in the early 2000s, as well as the unconventional monetary policies that the industrial countries have engaged in, have the primary effect of altering your exchange rate and pushing capital. And given that, they essentially creating problems for others, have large negative spillovers without the commensurate positive spillovers domestically. That if you had a policy which increased domestic growth enough and therefore allowed you to act as an engine of world growth, that would be reasonable. That offsets any negative spillover effects that you might have. But if the primary effect is through the exchange rate, depreciating your currency, trying to sell goods to others while pushing capital to them, then in fact, you could argue you're not playing the appropriate role as global citizen, you're having more effects outside than inside. Unfortunately, if you look at central banking mandates across the world, no central bank has a mandate for the world. Its mandate is purely domestic. What are you going to do to elevate employment and growth? It has to worry about the world only at second level. If I do something which creates problems for another country, and as a result, demand from that country falls off for my country's goods, I should take that into account. The feedback effects, but not the feed forward. I don't care if I destroy that other country completely, so long as it doesn't import from me. I'm okay, right? That kind of sort of domestic mandate is actually there in every country. This is not pointing fingers at any central bank. We haven't got mandates for the world. And as a result, monetary policy, even in its most aggressive kind, and I want to put an equivalence between unconventional monetary policy and direct exchange rate intervention because sometimes they have the same effect. And I want to argue that we are in a world where there's nothing that prevents these kinds of policies. There's nobody looking at them. The IMF is supposed to look at these things in a global sense, but the IMF has been sitting on the sidelines applauding these kinds of policies right from when they were initiated and hasn't really questioned the value of these kinds of policies. Yes, it does spillover studies, but the spillover studies invariably say this is good for that country and therefore good for the world. So I think we need to examine these issues again. So bottom line, can we do better? Yes, we can do better. Of course, the world needs more investment, and that means in the emerging markets that have the need for infrastructure investments, such as ours, we need to do much more investment. We certainly are prepared to do it. We have large plans on the anvil. We're beginning to do them. The Delhi Mumbai Industrial Corridor, the Eastern and the Western Freight Corridors, lots of plans, and we are embarked on it. But emerging markets embarking on infrastructure also need support. There is now a view that multilateral institutions don't need to provide finance. All they need to do is provide advice, because the private markets can do the rest. But private markets can do a lot. But private markets are not often the best source of patient risk capital. And sometimes patient risk capital with knowledge is what the multilateral institutions provide. At a time when the world needs infrastructure, shrinking the multilateral institutions is not a great idea. And the fact that there is space here is a reason why we have all these new institutions coming up. Ideally, India has always stood for global engagement, global multilateralism. We want the existing multilateral institutions to be strengthened, not weakened. From the industrial country perspective, there certainly is scope for investment, but it may not be the typical infrastructure. It may be green infrastructure. That we know that the world has to deal with climate change and environmental issues sooner rather than later. Perhaps the onus of the investment to deal with that has to come from the industrial countries, which have a much greater responsibility for the current levels of carbon in the atmosphere. So an emphasis on green in the industrial countries, of course we have our part to play in the emerging markets, and we will. But an emphasis on replacing the existing stock of investment, which is non-green, to investment which is green, is something the industrial countries can do much more of. It's a clear need. It is something that can be revived at this point. And I think the countries that are emphasizing this, such as Germany, Japan, and to some extent the United States, are going down the right path there. We need new rules of the game on policy. And I think we always retreat as central bankers to say we have a domestic mandate. What we need is a political consensus to go beyond domestic mandates, to think in this integrated world where monetary policies affect each other, what might be a sensible way of moving forward. I don't want to pose any easy solutions to this. Happy to discuss it in the debate, but it is something that we need to do. Now, even while I say we need a better cohesion, a better coordination on at least mandates, I would also say that we have to be very careful in this world in avoiding financial repression. Let me explain. Even while I say impatient capital flows easily across borders, every country today needs patient capital. In the industrial countries, it's about financing the long-term pensions that are going to be due, in financing the debt of governments. And similarly, in the emerging markets, is financing long-term infrastructure. One worry is that with the spate of new regulations that are coming up in the financial sector, that it tends to be biased against long-term patient flows to the emerging markets, because long-term flows have a much higher risk weight, and flows to emerging markets, which are lower rated than industrial countries, also have a higher risk weight. So as we are getting stronger and stronger regulations in the financial sector, it may have the effect of chilling the needed flows, even while the less needed flows are encouraged relatively because they're short-term, invested in government securities, etc., and can be pulled at a moment's notice. So the worry is long-term patient capital should not be repressed by the kinds of global regulation that we're getting in, so that capital which is needed in the emerging markets sits in the industrial countries and doesn't move, while the unneeded or less needed capital flows more effectively. Given that we have these capital flows, and certainly it's very hard to separate the good from the bad, we probably also need better global safety nets to ensure that those who accept this capital and who use it have Now, typically the IMF is supposed to do this kind of activity, but unfortunately, because of past history, certainly in Asia, but to some extent in Latin America, there's an enormous stigma in going to the IMF, which is why countries in the region are developing regional arrangements rather than going to the multilateral institution. For example, we have lent $1.5 billion to Sri Lanka as part of of a swap arrangement we have with them. But this, better than this, would be a stronger multilateral global safety net, and we need to work towards making that possible. It would be needed because going directly to the IMF carries enormous stigma, and very few countries in Asia are willing to do that. Of course, the concern amongst a number of countries that would put up the money is moral hazard. If we make money too easy, lots of countries will do things that are not appropriate, get into trouble, and then call for funding. But there has to be a way to balance these two interests, and we need to find out a way to make these global safety nets up and running. Otherwise, there will be countries that will be left out and not have any kind of succor when, in fact, the global financial conditions change. One proposal that has been put out, which deserves examination, is central bank swap lines mediated and backed up by the fund. There are some proposals like this floating, but at this point we need political support for something like this because central banks simply don't have the capability of agreeing to this on their own. And finally, we need better legitimacy for the global multilateral institutions. This is not just about quotas, which are held up, say, for the IMF. This is not just about who appoints the managing director or where the managing director comes from. This is more about having a more inclusive discussion, which means, one, the agendas that are proposed for what we work on have to be more inclusive and reflect the interests of the developing countries and emerging markets also. It cannot be just driven by what is important on the industrial country plate. The staff of these institutions typically tend to have a worldview which is driven by where the institution is located and where they hire from. Doesn't matter that they have citizens from all countries. If the citizens have all been to the same kinds of institutions in the industrial world and then live in Washington or Frankfurt or somewhere else, they tend to have a worldview which is driven by that location. And that also makes it much harder for them to appreciate what is happening elsewhere. So we need to think about how we deal with that issue also. But finally, I think, and this is where I will come back to the T20, we need more capacity in the emerging markets. I say propose agendas. Well, the industrial countries will push back and say, you can propose an agenda anytime you want. We don't do it. We don't do it often because we haven't thought enough. We haven't developed our own capacity to provide new ideas to the global financial system. So we're almost always in reactive mode. What do they say? Do we like it or do we not? Instead of saying, here's what we say. For the first time, with the new institutions that are being proposed by largely by China, we're starting to put some new alternatives on the table. But we must, across the emerging world, realize that some of the reasons why global governance seems to be sort of against us is we're not putting enough resources into this. Let me give you just one example. The G20 Framework Working Group is supposed to be co-chaired by Canada and India. So it's a fair arrangement, an emerging market with an industrial country. But Canada has 7 strong economists working on this group, trying to further the agenda, while India brings far fewer people to the table. Because we don't have that strength in the number of economists who can actually contribute. Yes, but we don't have people working in government who have that kind of training and that kind of capacity. And as a result, what happens is more of the pen and the writing is done by the Canadians, and they've stepped up to the plate. This is a natural consequence. But it would be far better for us to bring more people to that working group so that we act as equal partners rather than let them do the writing while we do the commenting. Okay, so in fact, when I was co-chair of that working group, we actually wrote a few. And it turned out it makes a big difference who has the pen. Because what you write is very different. And actually we did the first piece on spillovers in February of 2013, before the taper tantrum, saying this is something that we need to start worrying about as industrial country monetary policies normalize. And it was something that at least shone the spotlight on something we needed to talk about and was very important. So bottom line, a lot of demand for growth. Policies that add to global growth could be far better, and perhaps there's a reason to coordinate because countries are indulging more in policies that shift growth from others to themselves rather than create more growth for the global economy. So while staying away from protectionism, that's a benefit of the global economy today, we may have strayed into comparative easing, and that's a concern. We do need to look at globally optimal policies, and for that, I think we need to focus